about the Medicaid Trust. If you want to prevent your assets or those of your parents from being used to pay for nursing home costs, then you must plan ahead, way ahead. Should your resources permit you, purchasing long-term care insurance is one option. The problem is that it is the most expensive way to make sure one's assets will not end up financing a stay in a long-term care facility. As with any type of insurance, the earlier one has it in place, the better. A typical policy as of this writing costs about $24,000 per year for a 55-year-old single person and up to $72,000 per year for a 60-year-old couple. They'll typically need to start paying for it for several years, even decades, before they actually need it. The earlier one gets it, the less expensive the monthly payments will be. A better option, the Medicaid Trust. I've been in the asset protection and trust formation business for 27 years. Our company is 112 years old, and we are the largest asset protection company in the nation. Creating a Medicaid trust is a much less expensive option. A Medicaid trust, sometimes erroneously called a Medicare trust, is an irrevocable trust. It holds the assets of future nursing home patients. It must be properly worded and have a trustee, which can be your children, other relative, or an independent third party. To make sure Medicaid will not disallow any assets you include in the trust, you must set it up and transfer assets into it at least 5 years prior to entering a nursing home or applying for long-term care. This is called a 5-year look-back period. Some people make the big mistake of giving away assets to family members instead of creating a trust. One big problem with this scenario is that it can create a tremendous gift tax bill. If the same family member received the assets after the parent or grandparent died, there would likely be no tax bill at all, that is, unless the assets were in the multi-millions. Other, perhaps larger problems arise when the children or grandchildren who's received your house, car, or bank account run into problems. Say they're sued. Perhaps they run into a tax problem, die, get divorced, or incur a huge hospital bill. Grandma's home or mom's home, automobile, and accounts could be confiscated. Those are some additional reasons why a much better option is the Medicaid Trust. Moreover, this type of trust is a valuable part of estate planning. It can help you avoid the expensive and time-consuming probate process. How will Medicaid Trust work? Assets are placed into an irrevocable Medicaid Trust. The future Medicaid recipient can use the assets just as before. However, since the assets are held by the trust instead of the recipient, the government does not count those assets for qualification purposes. So mom or grandma can still live in the house, use the furniture, drive the car held by the trust, and so on. However, grandma will not hear your assets are too valuable to qualify for this program. This is because the assets will not be in grandma's name. Instead, there are generally provisions in the trust so that her kids, grandkids, etc., can receive the assets after her passing. The perils of long-term care insurance. As people live longer, paying for long-term care insurance becomes very expensive. In the United States, less than 8% have long-term care insurance. The prohibitive costs and varying coverage restrictions are often enough to deter the average American. So most do not purchase long-term care insurance. Additionally, many people are in denial about needing long-term care when they get older. That's something that happens to other people. The truth, however, is quite grim. According to data released by the Center for Retirement Research, the odds that older Americans will typically need some type of long-term care assistance are up to 58% for women and 44% for men. The cost for a nursing home stay or health care long-term vary greatly from one state to the next. But older Americans can expect to pay tens of thousands of dollars every year for long-term care, up to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, no matter where in the country they live. This can come out of their own pockets, Medicaid, or paid for by a long-term insurance policy. This cost is expected to keep getting higher with each passing year. And in light of this scenario, purchasing long-term care insurance several years before you reasonably expect to need it adds up to a very, very expensive option. One is almost always better off financially to set up a Medicaid trust and invest the money that would have gone toward premiums into your savings account. Protect assets from nursing home costs. There are ways to mitigate the cost of long-term care insurance and protect more of your assets from nursing home costs. For example, you could buy a plan with limited coverage, then pay for what the plan does not cover with your savings, or you can opt to get a reduced daily benefit or even limit the number of years the benefits are paid. If you can afford to do so well in advance of needing the long-term care, ideally when you're in good health and young, purchasing long-term care insurance might be a sensible and prudent option. However, it is a very expensive way to ensure that your assets will not be used for long-term care, should you end up needing it when you're older. Moreover, there is always a possibility that you may not ever collect on a long-term care insurance policy. This is because you may not end up needing it or because long-term care is not something that is required by your particular health situation. The insurance industry does opt for options such as life insurance policies that come with long-term care and benefits, and if you pass away without using the long-term care benefits, your heirs will receive the death benefit. This is just as they would with a typical life insurance policy. However, if you need to avail of the long-term care benefits, you can use the death benefits. This may pay for whatever long-term care you need. If there's anything left after you pass, it can go away or it could go to your heirs if not used. Long-term care from Medicaid. The majority of Americans will end up relying on Medicaid for the long-term care. However, before you qualify for long-term care for Medicaid, your existing financial resources must meet the set threshold. The problem is this threshold is extremely low, and some states require Medicaid recipients to have no more than $2,000 in savings and less than $50 a month in order to qualify. Now, what happens to Americans who need long-term care who cannot afford long-term care insurance? Plus, what if they do have certain assets that puts them above the Medicaid threshold? If it happens often for elderly Americans to spend down their financial resources. They do this so that they can meet the Medicaid threshold and qualify for long-term care. This means they pay for long-term care out of their own resources, and then once depleted, there may be such a time they can qualify for Medicaid. The problem is that spending down your assets and financial resources to qualify for Medicaid long-term care means there's nothing you can leave behind. When you die, your children, spouse may be left with nothing, with the possible exception of your house. But this is only for as long as the value of your property meets the maximum allowable value. This is established by the state where you live. If your house is assessed to be above this maximum allowable value, you could lose it in some states. Medicaid 5-year look-back period. Additionally, Medicare has, as we talked about, a 5-year look-back window. The time frame is for assets that you transfer into a trust or sell. People who do this typically sell them for below market value and then sell them to family members and or friends before applying for long-term care. Transfers of certain assets may be disallowed if they are made less than 5 years before you enter a nursing home or assisted living facility. If they're disallowed, this means that you still own them. Therefore, you have to spend them down before you can qualify for Medicaid long-term assistance. Irrevocable Medicaid Trust. Understandably, you may have certain assets that you wish to leave behind for your children or spouse when you die. One way to avoid spending down your assets to qualify for Medicaid is this. Create an irrevocable Medicaid Trust, as we have discussed. The assets you use to fund the trust will not be counted for Medicaid eligibility. This is as long as neither you, the person applying for Medicaid, nor your spouse has direct access to the principal or is named as the trustee. Set up the trust properly. An irrevocable Medicaid trust, when set up properly, protects your assets from Medicaid spend down. It allows you to qualify for long-term care at the same time. It also means your assets can pass down to your spouse and children when you die. That is, if it is so stated in the terms of the trust. Keep in mind, however, that you have to establish the trust early, then transfer the assets into it at least 5 years before applying for Medicaid long-term care benefits. If you do not meet this 5-year minimum, Medicaid may judge your asset transfer in the trust as void and will count your assets in determining your eligibility or ineligibility for long-term care. The goal. The goal of a Medicaid trust is to disassociate you from your assets. That way, they will not be considered in determining your eligibility for long-term care for Medicaid. In this respect, almost any type of domestic or offshore irrevocable trust will basically accomplish the same goal as a Medicaid trust. However, keep in mind that these asset protection vehicles may fall under a completely separate set of rules and regulations. So it's best to do your homework, get advice, and consult a trusted professional, and do both as early as possible if you can. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, more than 70% of Americans over 65 will need some type of long-term care assistance at some point in their lives. 40% of Americans who reach 65 will likely enter a nursing home care facility. And this is just for one type of long-term care. There are others. For 20% of these elderly Americans, the average stay in a nursing home will typically last about 5 years. While most Americans think long-term care is something that others need and not them, these grim statistics clearly say otherwise. Play by the rules. Nobody is ever advised to purposely attempt to defraud Medicaid by hiding assets from nursing home costs through illegal means. However, protecting your assets from Medicaid through trust is a perfectly legal and, in fact, financially shrewd maneuver. A less expensive option. As we have said, setting up a Medicaid trust is a much less expensive option than long-term care insurance. Keep in mind, to make sure Medicaid will not disallow the assets included in your trust, set it up early. That is, at least 5 years prior to entering a nursing home or applying for long-term care, as we have stated. In conclusion, nobody wants to think of ever needing long-term care, but the truth is this happens much more often and to far more people than we realize or can admit. Take the steps to make sure your assets are legally safeguarded from nursing home costs. Doing so means you have a higher chance of being eligible for Medicaid long-term care benefits. It also means you get to leave behind something for the people you care about the most. If you have more questions, give us a call at the number you see on your screen or visit assetprotectionplanners.com. Thank you.